In February 2023, a coastal storm struck the English Channel with record-breaking force, carving away 30 meters of chalk cliff along the Dorset shoreline. Amid the wreckage, a rusted steel door appeared, half buried beneath centuries of sediment. Local surveyors marked it as bunker debris, but when the Royal Engineers arrived 2 days later, radiation counters spiked, and the site was cordoned off under the label MOD XCAV 2023 Zoran 7B. Within a week, satellite imagery of the location vanished from public access. What lay beyond the corroded hatch was a labyrinth sealed since the 1940s, walls lined with decayed canisters and faded insignia of the British War Office. Files would later identify it as the operational hub of something called Operation Tidefall. The documents said it never existed. Chapter 1: Operation Tidefall, Britain's Silent Coastline. The first records referencing Operation Tidefall appear only as fragments in declassified memoranda from the Ministry of Defence, dated between 1945 and 1952. Each page carries a redacted header, Chemical Defence Experimental Establishment, Porton Down, Division 9, and a handwritten annotation, Transfer of Assets to Coastal Facility, REF, TDF 14C. What made this transfer unusual was its destination, an unlisted coordinates set, 50.682° N, 2.0157° corresponding precisely to the Dorset Cliffs where the 2023 storm exposed the hidden entrance. When the initial reconnaissance team entered, they found a passageway reinforced with naval-grade concrete, narrowing into a subterranean grid of sealed compartments. Decay had consumed most markings, yet traces of stenciled lettering remained visible under UV light. Admiralty Storage, Contamination Risk, Type H. According to a confidential interim report compiled by the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, DSTL, recovered objects included corroded dispersal tubes, filtration drums, and handwritten maintenance logs dated 1959, 15 years after the war's end. The existence of post-war entries immediately raised questions. Why was a wartime installation still active during the height of the Cold War? The report, coded DS-XCAV 17A, suggested the bunker may have been repurposed under naval biological deterrence programs. Yet the materials analysis contradicted that assumption. Trace chemical residues detected on the interior walls contained compounds consistent not with nerve agents, but with aerosolized saline and protein structures, suggesting large-scale atmospheric dispersion tests, the kind used to simulate biological weapon behavior without deploying lethal pathogens. The deeper the team advanced, the stranger the findings became. Beneath a rusted ventilation shaft, engineers uncovered a secondary chamber sealed by a welded hatch. Thermal imaging revealed intact equipment inside, prompting an excavation order issued under MOD Directive R3497. The hatch was cut open on March 11, 2023. Inside lay rows of wooden crates marked Property of the Admiralty, 1944, and in the far corner, a metal filing cabinet fused by rust. When pried open, its contents, over 200 documents preserved by vacuum seals, provided the first clear reference to Operation Tidefall. The folder headers bore designations typical of naval countermeasure trials: coastal defense research, atmospheric response testing, non-persistent agent control, and civilian dispersion data collection. Among the papers was a partially burnt operations plan dated 16th May 1944, signed by Rear Admiral H.A. Sutcliffe, whose service record abruptly ends in December of that year. The plan described controlled release events along the south coast, involving modified decommissioned destroyers positioned offshore, codenamed Phase Grey Wind. These tests were meant to study how aerosolized compounds traveled inland under varying wind conditions. According to the summary, the trials aimed to assess vulnerability of British ports to chemical attack, information that would be invaluable during the anticipated German gas offensives that, ultimately, never came. The document bore one final line in black ink: data to remain under naval jurisdiction, non-disclosure to Army Chemical Corps. Forensic analysts working on the rediscovered papers noted inconsistencies in document aging. While most pages matched the 1940s paper stock, several were printed on pulp consistent with 1950s manufacturing. These later entries referenced renewed activity under American observation, REF, Joint Maritime Initiative, 1962. The US Navy was indeed collaborating with British counterparts during that period, particularly in biological and radiological research. Cross-referencing newly declassified Pentagon papers revealed a chilling connection. An unpublicized NATO project, Marbo 12, tasked with studying non-lethal aerosol tracking agents across European coastlines. When journalist and military historian Emma Cartwright obtained access to the Dorset files through a Freedom of Information request, her findings reignited public interest. What the documents describe isn't illegal by definition, she explained in a 2024 interview, but it suggests a continuity of experimentation that bypassed parliamentary oversight. Cartwright's analysis of the original microfilms revealed that Operation Tidefall was administratively dissolved in 1948, yet its logistical funding, through coded treasury accounts, continued under civilian scientific grants until 1971. The bunker's architecture told its own story. The layout mirrored known British experimental facilities like those at Porton Down and Nanticoke, featuring parallel corridors and negative pressure containment zones. Inside one chamber, marked Zone 4C, investigators found a single metallic cylinder mounted vertically, its serial number still legible, AER7ADM45. Laboratory testing confirmed that residue inside the tube contained micro-encapsulated particles of sea salt coated with paraffin wax, a non-lethal tracer agent once used to mimic the dispersal behavior of chemical aerosols. Yet the records recovered beside it contained atmospheric readings far exceeding what such harmless materials could produce. Datasheets referenced population exposure estimates for coastal towns from Lyme Regis to Weymouth, implying that real-world civilian monitoring occurred without consent. A secondary cache of documents was discovered in a drainage trench beneath the main hall, sealed in oilcloth. Among them was a reel of decayed 16mm film. After digital restoration, the footage revealed grainy images of naval personnel in protective gear, loading canisters onto a small trawler. The boat's hull bore the designation HMS Radstock, a vessel officially retired in 1943 and listed as scrapped. The camera pans across the water as mist drifts toward the cliffs, then cuts abruptly. On the film's edge, faint handwriting reads, Trial B, Phase 2, Coastal Drift Success. By late 2023, a parliamentary inquiry had been quietly convened under the name Committee on Historical Defense Testing Practices. Most of its sessions were closed to the public. Unofficial leaks indicated that government representatives were seeking to classify parts of the discovery for national security reasons. An internal memo from the Cabinet Office, dated November 14, 2023, stated, while findings at Site TDF-14C suggest no active hazard, the political ramifications of unauthorized experiments must be mitigated. Historians soon traced the administrative trail back to one man, Professor Leonard R. Bishop, a Royal Navy chemist whose personnel file was sealed in 1950. Bishop had served as scientific director at Porton Down during the war, specializing in atmospheric particle studies. In 1945, he was reassigned to the newly formed Coastal Research Division, an entity with no surviving charter or documentation. His final known publication, Maritime Aerosol Dynamics, appeared in a restricted naval journal in 1946. Beyond that, Bishop disappeared from all records. Yet inside the Dorset bunker, beneath the corroded equipment, a small notebook was recovered, bearing his initials and laboratory shorthand. The entries end abruptly on 3rd of December 1946, with one final line. Test exceeded projections. Evacuation ordered. Seal under TDF protocol. When investigators re-entered the sealed chamber where the notebook was found, they noticed a single anomaly. A section of the floor appeared newer, poured with a different type of concrete. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed a cavity beneath. Excavation revealed a steel crate encased in resin, labeled Top Secret, Mod Ref 4276 6A, Do Not Open. After consultation with the Atomic Weapons Establishment, the crate was opened under controlled conditions. Inside lay a collection of lead-lined sample containers, each marked with handwritten tags, Specimen AE. Tests revealed nothing radioactive, but chemical analysis detected residues of polypeptide chains, biological in nature, synthetic in origin. No known British research in 1944-46 had achieved such synthesis. The discovery prompted speculation that Operation Tidefall had been part of a clandestine attempt to develop an early biological countermeasure or delivery system. one whose existence violated both the Geneva Protocol and subsequent national policies. The Defense Ministry, facing mounting media pressure, issued a brief statement on December 8, 2023. Site TDF-14C remains under investigation. Preliminary findings indicate historic research of a non-offensive nature. The statement did little to quiet speculation. As of early 2024, the bunker remains sealed again under reinforced barriers. Yet whispers persist within the archival community that additional tidefall-related sites exist along the coast, unmapped, unacknowledged, and possibly still intact. Cartwright's forthcoming book, Britain's Silent Coastline, claims to include coordinates from suppressed, wartime survey maps labeled TDF-12, TDF-19, and TDF-24. Whether these point to further bunkers or merely decoys remains uncertain. What is certain is that Operation Tidefall, once erased from history, now stands as a testament to the quiet lengths nations go to defend themselves, and the even quieter lengths they go to hide what they did in the name of defense. Chapter 2: Operation Tidefall, Britain's Silent Coastline. By early 2024, the discovery at Dorset had already begun to ripple through the closed corridors of Britain's defence and intelligence communities. What had first seemed a routine archaeological anomaly now bore the weight of a state secret long buried under chalk and silence. A second Ministry of Defence team, designated Recovery Group Delta, was assembled from elements of DSTL, the Royal Engineers, and the National Archives Historical Security Division. Their mission: to reconstruct the full operational framework of Tidefall. Among them was analyst Dr. Alice Farrow, a specialist in post-war chemical documentation. She had previously worked on the declassification of Porton Down's wartime aerosol studies, but even she was unprepared for the inconsistencies within Tidefall's surviving paperwork. The archival pattern didn't match any known protocol, she noted in an internal briefing dated March 5, 2024. It reads less like an experiment and more like a cover sequence, one file leading deliberately into another. The team's investigation began not underground, but in London, inside the temperature-controlled vaults of the National Archives, Kew. There, Farrow and her colleagues sifted through thousands of microfilm reels labelled under Naval Experimental Operations. They found dozens of cross-references to coastal monitoring, atmospheric analysis trials, and civil maritime defence. But whenever Tidefall's codename appeared, the adjoining reel segment had been cut, leaving gaps of exactly 12.5 seconds on playback, a surgical precision suggesting intentional excision. The earliest remaining mention came from file ADM 4321-17B, dated 2nd April 1945, a communication between the Admiralty and the War Office concerning deployment of atmospheric recording units to Station 9, Dorset Sector. Station 9, long presumed to be a radar outpost, had never appeared on any public registry. Meanwhile, at the Dorset site, technicians continued their subterranean survey. Using LiDAR mapping, they discovered that the bunker extended far deeper than initial estimates. A vertical shaft, previously obscured by collapsed debris, led down another 40 meters to a secondary level. It contained 4 sealed rooms, each identified by numerical stencils: 1A, 2A, 3A, and 3B. The air was still, dense, and metallic. Sensors registered residual particulate levels far higher than normal environmental baselines, forcing the crew to enter in full protective gear. The most striking feature was a large mural painted across one wall, faded outlines of the British Isles, overlaid with red concentric circles spreading outward from the southern coast. In one corner, the words Controlled Dispersion Range, TDF Zone 3, were faintly legible. Farrow reviewed photographs of the mural that evening in her hotel room. The circles corresponded precisely to meteorological drift models used in Operation Sea Spray, an infamous 1950 US Navy experiment involving the release of bacterial tracers over San Francisco. Tidefall's data appeared to predate that by at least 6 years. She cross-referenced the markings with historical wind pattern data from the British Meteorological Office and discovered that one of the concentric zones overlapped directly with the coastal town of Weymouth, population 23,000 in 1945. Hospital records from that period, recently digitized, showed a sudden spike in respiratory illness reported in June and July of that year. At this stage, the investigation took a new turn, The Cabinet Office authorized access to restricted health archives under the Civilian Defense, Medical Oversight Act. Among these, Ferro uncovered an unsigned memorandum dated 29 June 1945. Field observations, Weymouth Sector. Atmospheric trial conducted under TDF Op2. Monitor civilian health indices discreetly through local medical practitioners. No public disclosure authorized. Results to Admiralty liaison. Refm 4H ADM TDF. The language was chillingly bureaucratic. The trial had indeed extended into populated areas. Weeks later, new evidence emerged from an unexpected source. A retired naval clerk, Henry Davies, came forward after recognizing the name Tidefall in a newspaper article. At 97 years old, he was one of the last surviving administrative assistants from the Admiralty's Chemical Defense Branch. Recorded testimony on April 12, 2024, revealed his recollection of a 1946 directive ordering the transfer of sealed crates from Porton Down to a southern facility under maritime jurisdiction. "They told us it was decontamination material," Davies said, voice trembling, but the boxes were stamped with a red circle and the word Tidefall. "We were told never to ask questions, never to sign them into the registry." Davies's testimony, though fragmented, aligned with the recovered maintenance logs found in the bunker, entries made by personnel identified only by initials. One recurring signature, LB, matched the missing scientist, Leonard Bishop. Forensic handwriting analysis confirmed the match. Bishop's final entries in 1946 detail an unsanctioned modification to dispersal systems, authorized by ADM oversight. The final note reads simply, "Control lost after trial Delta, awaiting evacuation orders." There is no subsequent documentation of what trial Delta entailed. On May 3, 2024, the investigative team gained authorization to drill through the final sealed compartment, Room 3B. Inside, they discovered a metallic drum encased in lead lining, preserved under a crust of calcified residue. The drum bore a label almost too faded to read, TDF Delta 46, sample retained for calibration. Within it, analysts found what appeared to be a solidified gel. Chemical spectroscopy revealed a composition of salt, protein, and synthetic lipid chains, consistent with experimental carrier compounds developed for aerosol-based biological simulations. But one compound stood out, a synthetic enzyme structure not recorded in British research until 1958. That anomaly suggested either that post-war researchers had re-entered the site or that British scientists had achieved breakthroughs earlier than history acknowledged. The findings were quickly sealed under Official Secrets Act provisions, but not before a partial lab report was leaked to a major newspaper. Public outrage followed, with headlines demanding to know whether civilians along Britain's southern coast had unknowingly been exposed to military experiments. Parliament convened an emergency committee, during which MOD spokesperson Colonel Richard Avery insisted that no hazardous or weaponized substances have been detected. His statement was technically true, yet deliberately evasive. The gel's synthetic structure was inert, but its formula indicated potential use as a carrier for pathogens or counteragents. As political pressure mounted, Ferro continued her quiet analysis. Through archival cross-matching, she discovered a cryptic line in a 1963 intelligence summary declassified from US archives under the Freedom of Information Act. UK aerosol trials, codenamed TDF, yielded atmospheric data used in Joint Coastal Contingency Study. The report listed a reference, JCCS 62-44, and the phrase sample data supplied via naval exchange. In other words, Operation Tidefall's legacy had crossed the Atlantic. The deeper Ferro probed, the more she uncovered signs that the Dorset facility was only one node in a broader network. In an unindexed annex of the Admiralty archives, she found procurement orders referencing TDF-12A, TDF-19C, and TDF-24D. Each bore unique shipping manifests for identical equipment, air pumps, filtration grids, and aerosol dispersal units, shipped to various coastal regions, Cornwall, Pembrokeshire, and the Isle of Skye. None of those sites appear in public naval infrastructure records. It wasn't an isolated test, Ferro wrote in her field report. It was a chain, designed to map the entire atmospheric behavior of Britain's coastlines. The motive remained unclear. Some historians posited that Tidefall had been an anticipatory defense study, meant to simulate enemy gas attacks in preparation for Operation Overlord. Others argued it represented an early form of deterrence research, paving the way for Cold War chemical modeling. Yet fragments of correspondence found at Dorset, particularly one addressed to Director Allied Research Division, Washington, D.C., hinted at a more politically sensitive origin. That letter, unsigned but dated 9 February 1946, referenced transference of test data for strategic negotiation. In plainer terms, Tidefall's results may have been part of post-war bargaining between Britain and the United States, offering experimental findings in exchange for funding or technological collaboration. Chapter 3: Operation Tidefall, Britain's Silent Coastline. In October 2024, 6 months after the Dorset excavation was sealed under renewed MOD directive, an encrypted data packet arrived anonymously at the BBC's investigative unit. The sender identified themselves only as WM. The contents included a digitized reel-to-reel recording labeled TDF Control, Session 4, 12/3/46, and a series of scanned photographs showing maps, instruments, and handwritten notes. The voice on the recording, aged but clear, identified itself as Commander R. Alden, Directorate of Coastal Research. The audio contained technical discussions of wind vectors, humidity ratios, and dispersal times. But at the 17-minute mark, Alden's tone changed. All civilian data will be transferred through the Medical Liaison Corps as standard influenza reporting. No mention of exposure. Admiral Sutcliffe's instructions are absolute. The recording cut off abruptly, leaving 3 seconds of static. The BBC's team consulted the Royal Navy's personnel archive. There was indeed a Commander Raymond Alden, last listed in 1947 as missing during a maritime accident near the Isle of Portland. His service file was never reopened. The discovery of this tape forced the MOD to respond, albeit cautiously. In a statement released 2 weeks later, officials confirmed that a number of historical audio materials had been recovered from secondary archives and were under authentication review. What they did not admit publicly was that the file designation on the tape, TDF Control, matched an internal project numbering system not used since 1946. Meanwhile, historian Emma Cartwright, who had published the first in-depth article on Operation Tidefall, was approached by a source within the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory. The source claimed that 2 additional Tidefall-related installations had been located, one near Bude, Cornwall, and another on the coast of Pembrokeshire, Wales. Both were embedded within abandoned radar monitoring facilities. Satellite imagery showed identical surface features to the Dorset site, circular access points and narrow ventilation shafts camouflaged under soil. Cartwright submitted a formal information request on 2 November 2024, but received no acknowledgement. Within days, the coordinates she cited were geo-fenced on major mapping platforms. Inside the National Archives, Dr. Alice Ferro continued her own search for corroborating evidence. Her breakthrough came from a misfiled folder in Box ADM 4398B. It contained correspondence between the Admiralty and the Treasury, dated 1951, referencing maintenance of coastal atmospheric facilities, TDF program continuation under civil grant coverage. The memo was signed by C.L. Winthrop, Deputy Finance Officer, who later joined the Atomic Energy Authority. This small administrative trace was significant. It confirmed that the government had not only preserved but financed the remnants of Tidefall well into the Cold War. Beneath one page was a handwritten annotation, circled twice. 1961, Integration about U.S. Data Exchange under Project Marbo 12. Ferro contacted an American counterpart, Dr. Marcus Delaney, an archival analyst at the U.S. National Security Archive, who located declassified references to Marbo 12. The project had collected meteorological and aerosol drift data across the Atlantic for use in early warning systems during potential chemical attacks. Delaney's analysis concluded that at least 3 Tidefall datasets had been integrated into NATO's modeling programs between 1962 and 1965. What began as a wartime contingency, he remarked, became the foundation of modern aerosol defense research. The difference is that no one ever admitted where the baseline data came from. Back in Britain, Ferro returned to Dorset under a special permit for archival verification. What she discovered was alarming. The site, supposedly inactive, was under reconstruction. Contractors from North Star Environmental Systems, the same company linked to the 1971 funding records, had erected temporary fencing, and were installing new ventilation shafts. The workers refused interviews, citing national security. Through binoculars, she observed containers marked with modern hazard labels. Bioaerosol study equipment, handle with care. Her photographs of the site were confiscated by MOD police later that evening. The official reason given: violation of restricted airspace photography laws. Unwilling to abandon the case, Ferro began analyzing one remaining lead from the recovered notebook of Leonard Bishop. Among his chemical annotations was a formula for AER9. Cross-referencing with declassified Porton Down studies revealed no such designation. However, through the private papers of a defunct maritime research firm in Southampton, she located a single 1947 invoice for AER9 prototype dispersal nozzles, billed to the Ministry of Supply, Tidefall account. Attached was a delivery receipt signed by Let Cedar R. Alden. The paper trail closed the loop between the missing naval officer, the resurfaced recording, and Bishop's laboratory notes. The timeline that emerged was stark. Between May 1945 and December 1946, Operation Tidefall conducted 4 live dispersal tests, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta, along the south coast of England. Civilian monitoring was disguised as influenza tracking under the Ministry of Health. In January 1947, following the collapse of Test Delta, the site was sealed and records were destroyed. Surviving data were transferred to a classified program under the Admiralty's Meteorological Division. In 1951, funding was reclassified as Civil Atmospheric Research. The work, quietly reabsorbed into Cold War defense studies, continued for at least 2 decades. Ferro compiled her findings into a confidential report titled Tidefall Continuum, a chronology of concealment. It detailed how scientific data gathered through unauthorized wartime trials had become foundational to Western military aerosol research. She submitted the report to the Parliamentary Defense Oversight Committee in December 2024. 3 weeks later, her clearance was suspended pending review of conduct. Colleagues reported that her office was emptied overnight. The MOD declined comment, but an anonymous email circulated among academic circles included a line purportedly from Ferro's final message. They're still using it. They just changed the names. Public attention reignited when a freelance journalist, James Hollow, published leaked excerpts from Ferro's draft in The Guardian. One passage described a sample canister missing from the Dorset cache. The unaccounted Specimen A5. Hollow connected it to an unexplained biological test conducted off the coast of Cornwall in 1958 under NATO auspices. Official documentation from that test, previously assumed to be meteorological, listed dispersal agents matching the chemical profile of the Tidefall residue. The implication was explosive. Tidefall had not ended in 1946, it had evolved, resurfacing under NATO control during the Cold War. Within weeks of the article's release, Hollow's sources retracted their statements. MOD representatives again denied any connection, yet the language of their press briefing betrayed unease. The ministry acknowledges historical research activities involving atmospheric dispersal modeling. These were consistent with defense standards of the time. In other words, not denial, just controlled admission. Cartwright's documentary team obtained copies of declassified aerial reconnaissance photos showing coastal anomalies consistent with multiple hidden installations. The footage, aired briefly before legal injunction, displayed uniform patterns of concrete entries extending from Cornwall to Pembrokeshire. The visual evidence matched the coordinates listed in the Dorset bunker's recovered maintenance logs. During post-production, however, the broadcast was pulled, replaced by a statement citing potential inaccuracies in historical verification. The raw footage was never aired again. In a private interview recorded off-camera, Cartwright reflected on the growing sense of obstruction. Every time we got close to something concrete, someone would quietly remove it. Files disappeared, access revoked. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. Tidefall wasn't an anomaly, it was infrastructure. By late 2024, whispers began circulating among defense journalists about a classified MOD review codenamed Resolution Protocol. Its purpose: to determine the extent of public exposure to unauthorized atmospheric research. No official acknowledgement was made, but an internal correspondence leaked to reporters included one haunting statement from a senior official. Our nation's safety has always depended on secrets. Some should remain buried under the cliffs. As the winter storms returned to the Dorset coast, the tide once again carved away at the land. Locals reported seeing new barriers erected at the excavation site, steel fencing and reinforced floodlights. When a civilian drone pilot attempted to capture footage in December 2024, his equipment was confiscated under the Civil Aviation Security Act. The area was now classified as a temporary military exclusion zone. Chapter 4: Operation Tidefall, Britain's silent coastline. The first frost of 2025 had barely settled over southern England when a new revelation shattered the uneasy silence surrounding Operation Tidefall. It began with a data leak from within North Star Environmental Systems, the private contractor now managing redevelopment of the Dorset site. The anonymous whistleblower, identified only as D14, sent encrypted documents to 3 journalists, including Emma Cartwright. The files bore the watermark of the Ministry of Defence Procurement Office and contained technical specifications for atmospheric sampling unit, model TDF-9X. Each blueprint carried a revision date, October 2024. Whatever Tidefall had been in the 1940s, it was no longer an artifact, it was active again. The documents revealed the existence of a modernized testing apparatus designed for high-altitude aerosol dispersion analysis. Embedded within the blueprints were notations referencing legacy calibration data, source, TDF-46 dataset. That dataset was the same recovered archive from the Dorset bunker. Someone inside the MOD had digitized and reactivated the Tidefall data, feeding it into current environmental systems research. When confronted, a ministry spokesperson described the program as climate resilience modeling, insisting it was unrelated to any military applications. But the phrasing on the internal project summary betrayed its true intent: simulation of foreign agent atmospheric behavior under variable coastal conditions. By January, Cartwright had assembled a coalition of investigative journalists and historians to examine the growing pile of evidence. Together, they traced procurement invoices to an address in Farnborough, Hampshire, the headquarters of the Defence Science and Technology Laboratories Applied Environmental Systems Division. A Freedom of Information request revealed a building renovation contract dated 2022, describing the construction of bioaerosol, containment bays and coastal drift calibration chambers. The architectural blueprints of the new facility bore identical structural markers to the original Dorset site. "It's a mirror," Cartwright told her team. "They've rebuilt Tidefall under a different name." Meanwhile, a digital forensics unit at King's College London analyzed metadata from the leaked files. Embedded in one technical note was a string of coordinates not relevant to the new equipment specifications. The location, 53,390 N, 4.0893 DGW, pointed to a remote stretch of the Welsh coastline near the village of Lynn, an area long associated with disused radar installations. Within weeks, drone footage confirmed the presence of reinforced bunkers, disguised under vegetation. Mod fencing surrounded the perimeter, and signage identified the site as Coastal Research Facility No. 4, Restricted Access. It was, by all indications, another Tidefall site brought back to life. The discovery spurred public outcry. Parliament's Defence Committee demanded an inquiry, but the proceedings were held behind closed doors. Portions of the hearing leaked to the press described a project designated Atmospheric Integrity Initiative, an innocuous name masking a continuation of aerosol-based research. One MP, speaking anonymously, later confirmed that Tidefall's data had been repurposed to develop predictive algorithms for biothreat dispersion. "They told us it was about pandemic preparedness," he said, "but the files clearly referenced controlled field simulations. We're recreating what we once buried." As public skepticism grew, Dr. Alice Ferro's name resurfaced. Though her clearance had been revoked months earlier, an encrypted message attributed to her began circulating in January 2025. The message contained excerpts from what appeared to be her final research notes. Specimen A5 contained synthetic protein markers coded for environmental traceability. If released, the compound could serve as an invisible identifier across atmospheric studies. It was designed to persist. If current systems still reference the TDF dataset, then A5 is still in circulation. This claim alarmed environmental agencies. Within weeks, atmospheric monitoring stations across southern England began testing for anomalous particulate signatures. On February 12th, a laboratory in Bristol reported elevated traces of polymerized protein structures consistent with Ferro's description. The MOD dismissed the results as lab error, yet internal correspondence later obtained by journalists showed that the same findings had been reported at 3 additional sites along the southern coast. The phrase A5 detection event appeared in several classified memos, followed by orders for immediate data suppression. Cartwright confronted the MOD directly during a televised interview. "If the Dorset experiments were benign," she asked, "why are you still using their data? And why are we detecting synthetic residues 80 years later?" The official response was cold and measured. All findings attributed to historic operations are under review. No public health risks are identified. But behind the camera, sources confirmed that North Star Environmental Systems had quietly expanded its contract to include remediation protocols for airborne contaminants. While public attention focused on the MOD's denials, an overlooked archival discovery provided the most chilling evidence yet. A retired archivist named George Merton contacted Cartwright with access to an abandoned sub-basement beneath the Admiralty building, long decommissioned after structural damage in the 1970s. Inside, Merton uncovered 4 rusted filing cabinets sealed with naval locks. The drawers contained operational charts, weather maps, and typed instructions stamped Top Secret, TDF Command. Among them was a complete after-action report from Trial Delta, the final known test before the bunker's closure in 1946. The report described an uncontrolled vector shift resulting in inland drift exceeding safety parameters. Civilian medical anomalies were logged but marked for deletion. Recommend immediate site containment and public obfuscation via influenza narrative, the report concluded. All materials to remain classified indefinitely. The file was authenticated by paper stock analysis and typewriter comparison, confirming its origin. Forensic archivists matched the signature on the final page to Admiral Sutcliffe, the same officer listed in earlier Tidefall documentation. His signature had been forged on at least 2 other declassified files, meaning the true authorship of many Tidefall orders remained uncertain. It wasn't one man's project, Merton said. It was an institutional decision. With the new evidence public, Parliament reopened the investigation. On March 18, 2025, a special session of the Defence Committee summoned MOD representatives for testimony. The hearing, later dubbed the Tidefall Inquiry, was partially televised. Documents presented during the session confirmed that data derived from Tidefall had been used continuously in defence research under various rebranded initiatives. Yet the government stopped short of admitting deliberate concealment. Instead, officials characterised the project as a historical legacy integrated into broader scientific development. The phrase echoed through the media, becoming shorthand for bureaucratic evasion. But the most startling moment of the inquiry came near its conclusion. A classified annex, read aloud in partial summary, described a continuity asset stored at an unspecified coastal facility, an experimental aerosol containment unit designed to simulate historic atmospheric conditions for calibration purposes. The device's internal sample reservoir was listed as containing trace compounds from legacy research, including biological and synthetic materials. When questioned, MOD officials refused to confirm whether this referred to specimen A5. The inquiry adjourned without resolution. Outside the committee room, protesters gathered beneath grey skies, holding signs that read, "Our air is not classified." Cartwright, emerging from the hearing, told reporters, "We keep looking for a single villain in this story, but Tidefall isn't a person, it's a habit, the habit of secrecy." In the months that followed, MOD press activity decreased to silence. The Dorset site was placed under permanent closure, and coastal monitoring equipment quietly expanded across southern England. Though the official narrative claimed environmental safety was the only concern, internal MOD dispatches leaked in April 2025 confirmed ongoing air sampling for synthetic particulate confirmation. Late that month, Ferro's encrypted message resurfaced, this time containing GPS metadata pointing to the Welsh coast, the coordinates of the Lynn facility. Satellite passes recorded faint thermal activity beneath the surface, suggesting equipment operation. Yet no inspection was ever authorized. As summer approached, the story faded from headlines, replaced by political turmoil abroad. Chapter 5. The Prague Codex, files that shouldn't exist. In May 2026, 6 months after the Tidefall inquiry fell into bureaucratic silence, a digital archivist named Pavel Richter stumbled upon a series of encrypted microfilm scans while restoring an online repository for the Czech National Library. The files were labeled in German and Russian, dated between 1944 and 1951, and referenced a codename he had never encountered before, Project Morgenfall. Most of the data was corrupted, but one frame stood intact, an inventory log for a joint research unit operating under the Soviet military administration in post-war Prague. The inventory's final entry read, Codex M74, zurückgehalten auf Befehl der Kommission. With translation, that meant Codex M74, withheld by order of the Commission. Richter contacted a historian at Charles University who specialized in Cold War archival systems. Within days, the Czech Interior Ministry seized his terminal. The official statement claimed Richter had accessed materials under international classification protocols. Yet in the brief hours before his system was confiscated, he managed to back up one document fragment to an external drive. It was a memo typed on British War Office letterhead, dated February 1946, addressed to the Control Commission for Germany and Austria. The subject line read, Transfer of captured Axis scientific materials, subset M74. What followed were 5 redacted paragraphs, describing an exchange of microfilm reels between British and Soviet intelligence for coordinated reconstruction of high-value wartime research. This was not unusual for the immediate post-war years. Operation Paperclip and its Soviet equivalents had already redistributed scientists and documents across Europe. But what set M74 apart was the mention of cross-discipline biological cybernetic integration prototypes, a term decades ahead of its time. The report's final sentence read, M74 material, not to be disclosed beyond Level 4 command. Designated repository Prague Sector D. By 2026, that repository no longer existed. The original structure, a Ministry of Industry annex on Vodičkova Street, had been demolished in 1989. But satellite imaging revealed substructures beneath the site, sealed vaults still intact. When investigators from the Czech Academy of Sciences requested excavation permits, they were denied pending national security consultation. Within a week, the area was fenced off, and access transferred to an unidentified private contractor. In June, Richter disappeared. Friends reported he had been followed for several days by 2 unmarked vehicles. His last known communication was an encrypted voice message sent to a colleague. The codex isn't a book, it's a data set. The message cut off mid-sentence. Authorities classified his case as a missing person investigation, but declined to comment on any relation to the codex materials. When journalists from Res Publica began tracing the chain of custody, they discovered a pattern. Since the 1990s, dozens of microfilm reels labeled M74 derivatives had been quietly relocated between archival facilities in Prague, Berlin, and Moscow. Customs documents referenced a joint data restoration initiative funded by a consortium of European defense contractors. The lead partner was listed as Orpheon Systems Limited, a London-based analytics firm with historic ties to British intelligence. Digging into Orpheon's corporate filings, journalists found that one of its founders had previously worked under a Ministry of Defense research branch connected to atmospheric modeling, the same division implicated in Operation Tidefall. Buried among the firm's patents was one titled Predictive Algorithm for Adaptive Environmental Systems, referencing calibration constants identical to those found in Tidefall's TDF-46 dataset. The implication was staggering. Data from a classified WWII research archive in Prague had somehow fed into modern defense modeling across Europe. Further inquiry revealed that Project Morgenfall had originated not in Prague, but in Leipzig in 1944, under the authority of the Reich Ministry for Armaments. Its objective, as reconstructed from partial files, was the integration of biological systems with early computational models, a primitive attempt to map human physiological responses into mechanical logic. Scientists involved in the project had theorized that environmental conditioning could be simulated and predicted mathematically. In its later Soviet phase, the research appeared to have merged with post-war psychological warfare programs. They were trying to quantify compliance, said Dr. Jana Kralova, a historian who reviewed the surviving documentation. Tidefall was about air, Morganfall was about thought. By mid-2027, an independent research collective known as Archive Zero obtained new digital fragments via darknet channels. The fragments contained schematic diagrams for Biocybernetic Integration Unit, Prototype 2, annotated in Russian. Marginal notes referred to input data sourced from TDF atmospheric control. If authentic, this meant that Operation Tidefall and Project Morganfall had been cross-referenced in the 1950s as part of a broader joint intelligence effort, one linking biological, psychological, and environmental control experiments under shared theoretical frameworks. The documents were authenticated through forensic type analysis and ink spectral comparison at the University of Amsterdam. One page included a British Defence Ministry stamp dated 1958. 12 years after the supposed closure of both projects. It wasn't two programs, Kralova concluded. It was one continuum divided for deniability. The more Archive Zero uncovered, the more resistance they met. Servers hosting the leaked files were repeatedly taken offline. 2 researchers were detained under charges of unauthorized access to protected data. One of them, a data historian named Ilona Marek, later revealed that the files included encryption signatures identical to those found in NATO's internal document handling systems. This implied that portions of the M74 dataset were still classified under Alliance jurisdiction, evidence that the codex, in some form, remained operational. In late August 2027, Kralova herself gained access to the recovered microfilm fragment that started the investigation. When digitally enhanced, faint notes became visible in the film margins. Interface subroutines transferred to BR Sector 9, Maintain. Compartmentalization. The BR designation matched an archival code used by the British War Office in the 1950s. Cross-referencing. With Modi archives revealed that Sector 9 corresponded to the same Farnborough facility implicated in Tidefall's modern revival. Everything circled back. The atmospheric experiments in Dorset, the reactivated data streams, the aerosol dispersion modeling, all of it had roots in the same wartime data pool codified within the Prague Codex. The Codex is the genome of secrecy itself, Kralova told Res Publica in her final interview. Every classified system built after the war is descended from it. Her words gained tragic weight 2 months later when she was found dead in her apartment, her laptop destroyed by fire. The cause was officially listed as accidental. Yet fragments recovered from the hard drive revealed a partially decrypted document bearing the header, Codex Continuation Directive, in 1998. The text within was incomplete, but one visible sentence read, "Maintain distributed architecture under environmental monitoring initiatives, public cover ensured through academic partnerships." By early 2028, the Czech government quietly dissolved its investigative task force. Public attention waned, and the story receded into the background noise of geopolitics. But among archivists and independent researchers, the term Prague Codex took on mythic significance, shorthand for a shadow lineage of wartime research that had never truly ended. Today, if you search the Czech National Library's digital archive for Project Morganfall, you'll find a placeholder file labeled Restricted Pending Verification. No metadata, no description, just a reference number. CZSEC M74 0001. Yet beneath that sterile entry lies the unresolved truth that both Tidefall and Morganfall hinted at, a transnational architecture of secrecy, born from the ashes of war and refined through decades of bureaucratic evolution.